Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ וביום השביעי שבת ויהי נפש ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ברית Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Mi Melech, Malachei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalom, Malachei Elyon. Mi Melech, Malachei HaMlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Rabbi Efrat Zohar, and I want to welcome you along with Cantor, Israel Rosen, and Robin Rosen this evening, and Matthew Lipman on technology to Temple Solel's Friday night Shabbat services. And boy, do we need Shabbat this week. That's the way I feel, and I bet you do too. So Cantor, how are we beginning this evening's service?
With a nigun, to give the feeling of the welcoming of Shabbat, and by Lecha Dodi we're gonna feel into the Shabbat. So, nigun. Lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai lai la lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai lai la lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai lai la lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai 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 lai. Lai 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 la lai. Lai lai la lai 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 lai.
And now I'd like to invite Robin Rosen to kindle our Shabbat lights. And this evening, we certainly need that spiritual light and energy for our hearts and our souls.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu להדליק נר של שבת.
Amen. And we continue with our beautiful Lecha Dodi as we bring in the Kala, the Shabbat Kala, and greet her and enter into Shabbat time.
לך דודי לקראת קהלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבורך דשמיענו, אל המיוחד אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד לשם מול תפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת קהלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי מקור הברכה מראש מקדם נאסוך. סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי לקראת קהלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי, התעוררי כי בא אורך. קומי אורי, 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 שיר דברי. כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי לקראת קהלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בוהים בשלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצהלה. תוך אמוני עם סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי לקראת קהלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לילה 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 פני שבת נקבלה.
And shalom aleichem. We need some shalom. Give us some shalom, Cantor.
שלום עליכם מלאכי השרת מלאכי עליון מי מלך מלכי המלאכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. בואכם לשלום מלאכי השלום מלאכי עליון מי מלך מלכי המלאכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ברכוני לשלום מלאכי השלום מלאכי עליון מי מלך מלכי המלאכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. צאתכם לשלום מלאכי השלום מלאכי עליון מי מלך מלכי המלאכים הקדוש ברוך הוא.
And now we have this essential moment in our worship service in which we close our eyes, we turn inward, we block out the distractions, and we recall and remember and affirm that there is a oneness in this world that ties everything together. And that oneness is the reality of all that is. And we Jews, we were the first in the world to recognize this oneness and to make it a central part of our people's mission to remind the world and ourselves of this oneness at all times, in all circumstances, in all places. We are connected and we are one because there is only oneness. And with that in mind and in our hearts, we proclaim Shema.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt. But there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, and that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together.
La 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 la. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה, אוסף אלה. מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקע ים לפני משה ומרים. מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקע ים לפני משה ומרים. זה לי אנו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם לעולם ועד. La 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 la. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
So instead of this particular prayer that we always say at this point, I'm going to read instead a prayer for our country that was written by my colleague, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. And it's very much apropos to this moment in time, a prayer that really addresses where we stand as a country. Our God and God of our ancestors, bless this country and all who dwell within it. Help us to be vigilant, compassionate, and brave. Strengthen us when we are afraid. Help us to channel our anger so that it motivates us to action. Help us to feel our fear so that we do not become numb. Help at greater risk, and that it is our holy work to stand with them. Help us to taste the sweetness of liberty, to not take for granted the freedoms won in generations past or in recent days. Help us to heal and nourish our democracy, that it may be, as the prophets wrote in our Tanakh, like a tree planted by the water whose roots reach down to the stream. It need not fear drought when it comes. Its leaves are always green. Source of life, guide our leaders with righteousness. Strengthen their hearts to keep them from hardening, that they may use their influence and authority to speak truth and act for justice. May all who dwell in this country share in its bounty, enjoy its freedoms, and be protected by its laws. May this nation use its power and wealth to be a voice for justice, peace, and equality for all who dwell on earth. May we be strong and have courage, to be bold in our action and deep in our compassion, to discern when we must listen and when we must act, to uproot bigotry, intolerance, misogyny, racism, discrimination, and violence in all its forms, to celebrate the many faces of God reflected in the wondrous diversity of humanity, to welcome the stranger and the immigrant, and to honor the gifts of those who seek refuge and possibility here, as they have since before this nation was born. As the prophet Isaiah proclaimed, and great leaders have spoken in generations thereafter, let justice well up like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amen.
ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי 6 ימים עשה אדוני, עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, וביום השביעי שבת ויהי נפש, שבת ויהי נפש, שבת ויהי נפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
And now we take a moment for private and personal prayer and meditation.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל.
And now we come to the part of our service where we think about all those in our congregational family and in our lives who are in need of healing, who need refuah shalema, a complete and speedy healing of the heart, of the soul, of the body. And tonight, who are we in particular praying for, Robin?
Ann Becker, Hannah Cates, Phyllis Lewis, Michelle Margulies, Gabriella Rosenthal, Seth Gelwasser, Ray Strauss, Martin Zafman, Sid Rabin, Don Harvey, Ida Kacherka, Sam Rotman, Tammy Held, Susan Rotman, Renee Esther Held, Kenneth Stephen Held, Randy Shattenkirk, Jane Weiner, Michael Slotnick, Charlie Wolf, Dr. Robert Greenstein, Mimi Cohen, Richard Blanky, Fred Lipman, Joe Bulick, Michelle Robinson, Andrew Goldstein, Tracy Fiokowski, Randy Lekel, Ellen Weiss.
And we also add Rachel Bat Fruma, Menachem ben Batya, Yankel Yosef ben Bracha, Avi Mordechai ben Hana, Tova bat Esther, Sarah bat Hana, Ari ben Miriam, Mordechai Avraham ben Esther.
Heal us now, heal us now, heal us now, heal us now. הושיע את עמך וברך את נחלתך, וראם ונשם עד העולם. מי שברך אבותינו, מי שברך אמותינו, אנא אדוני הושיענה. We pray for healing of our people. We pray for healing of the land and peace for every race or nation, every child, every woman, every man. El na refana, oh please heal us now. רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף, רפואה שלמה. Heal us now, heal us now, heal us now, heal us now. heal us now.
So, my sermon this evening is inspired by one that the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, has previously written. And in spite of being thoroughly British, Rabbi Sacks was a great admirer of the United States, our values, and our experiment in democracy. So how do I, as a rabbi, help you and help me, all of us, make sense of what happened Wednesday night in our nation's capital and find hope in what is truly a tragic circumstance that our country finds itself in right now? Before we dive into that, I want to acknowledge the emotions that I felt that evening and that likely you felt too and maybe still feel. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and maybe possibly a resignation at the end. So some of you will recognize what these 5 words point to. That is Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which were of course subsequently revised and added to by others, but no matter. We are a nation grieving what we have become. And let me add to that emotional mix a dollop of horror, true horror, watching people storm the Capitol and make light of the sanctity of the place that is our secular sacred ground in this nation. So how do we handle this? How do we reconcile this in our lives? What do we do about this? And what can Judaism tell us? So first, I want to say that from my perspective, I always try to find the upside in any situation. It's just my half glass full personality. And you might say, well, for heaven's sakes, an upside? What could possibly be the upside to this? Well, I did certainly have a moment of dark humor on Wednesday night, because after the election of this administration in 2016, I remember that the very first thing I thought of upon waking up and finding out the results the morning after was, I am so very, very, very glad that my beloved parents are dead. Yep, that's a pretty strange reaction, I know, but it was totally heartfelt because you see, my parents were totally straight shooters, by the book kind of people. Honesty, integrity, living by your word and your handshake, practicing kindness, great and small. These were the values they lived by and modeled for me every single day. And had they lived to see this administration in office, I know they would have been apoplectic every single day of the last 4 years. So ironically, I am glad that they, and also Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, were not alive on Wednesday night to have experienced the kind of pain that they would have experienced. I was glad they were not here on earth and were able to miss out on the debacle we witnessed. Secondly, then along came into my mind Psalm 126. There's a particularly a line that we recite in it, and many of you may recognize it from Birkat HaMazon, the grace that we say after meals, the prayer of thanks that we say to God for the wonderful bounty of the food that we eat. And towards the end of this prayer, we say, Hazorim bedim'ah Barina yiktsoru. Those who sow with tears will ultimately reap with joy. So how does that relate to us? Well, in talking with my husband about what we were witnessing, we remembered that in history, there are always ebbs and flows. There are high points and low points, and this country has had its ups and downs. And we have to have these moments to remind ourselves our work is not finished. So we had the Civil War. So many young men died. So many, there was an entire generation of men that was wiped out in this country. And there was an actual imbalance between men and women for over a generation. That Civil War led to freedom for the slaves, but only for a brief period of time. Recall your history. Reconstruction lasted for a mere 10, 11 years, and then in a compromise measure in 1876, Reconstruction and protection by federal troops was taken out of the South. And what came instead? Jim Crow and domestic white supremacist terrorism. And that lasted for a lot longer period of time than the Civil War and Reconstruction on their own. And then came the 1950s and the 60s and the era of civil rights. And once again, we had to fight. We had to fight for what was just and right. And finally, legislation gets passed in the 1960s, and the country rejoices, and we think, there we have it. We have conquered this scourge. And then, only mere months ago, our country had another awakening during this pandemic when George Floyd, for 8 minutes, his life was extinguished before our eyes. His murder by a police officer woke up this nation and reminded us we haven't conquered racism. We've made things better, but we have so much more work to do. And this is where we have to take a little bit of hope from the darkness. That what we're seeing is a flushing of the issues out into the open. We're seeing white supremacy. We're seeing people who value the Confederate flag and what it stood for. We're seeing Proud Boys and Holocaust deniers and all kinds of scum coming out into the open, confident that they are going to take this country back into their swamp. And I want to point out, if you didn't realize, that this has extreme obvious ramifications for Jews. Because while there is anti-Semitism on the far left, and while there is certainly anti-Semitism in extreme Islam, the violent anti-Semitism of the extreme right is what is the most dangerous at this moment in time. And when you see people wearing t-shirts that say Camp Auschwitz, and when you see people wearing t-shirts that say 6MWNE, you know what that stands for? That's the Proud Boys acronym for 6 million was not enough. We should not be fooled as Jews what we're up against. This is classic demagoguery, and we have seen this and we know how it ends. As an educator, we teach our teens in the March of the Living something that always surprises them, and perhaps it will surprise you too if you're not someone very well versed in recent history of the Shoah. Hitler did not begin in the 1930s with the final solution in mind. He developed it over time. Why? Because no other country would take in Jews other than a small number to the Dominican Republic. And when Hitler saw the world's indifference to our plight, that is when he realized, he and the Nazis who served him, that they could get away with anything, even a final solution. And so they began to prepare the mass murder of the Jewish people, but it wasn't something they began with. That's the only way, by the way, that civilized people can turn from, quote, normal into murderers. It's a gradual process. Let's not delude ourselves. We are looking at a process, and it can be stopped. It can only be stopped, though, when enough people make their righteous voices heard, and when they are perceived to be the radical majority, and when they are the ones who call and write and fax and send carrier pigeons, whatever it takes to get their perspective across. This is the time when our voices must outnumber the very loud, very extreme minority which is trying to destroy our country. We, the people, have freedom of speech still, the power to tell our leaders where they are going wrong and what we believe should be done. If you have not exercised your freedom of speech yet, and if you are not planning to do this over the next number of days until the end of this administration, to tell the people in power, our elected representatives, what you think of their actions, pro or con, then you are taking democracy for granted. And at this moment, we cannot do that as a country and as a citizenry. We must recognize right now, this is a time of danger. We will look back on this day as a turning point. We're right in the midst of it now, but we will look back at this time and historians will write many, many words about it. We have the ability to stop this now. And if we do not take up our pen and use our voice, then shame on us. It is up to each and every one of us to make our voices heard. And now I'd like to turn to Torah as a point of inspiration and to someone who has always been an inspiration, as Rabbi Sachs points out to us. The opening chapters of Exodus, the book of Exodus, where we are in this week's Parsha, they plunge us into the midst of epic events. Almost at a stroke, the Israelites are transformed from a protected minority into slaves. Moses passes from prince of Egypt to Midianite shepherd, to then the leader of the Israelites through a history-changing encounter at the burning bush. Yet it is one small episode that deserves to be seen as a turning point in the history of our entire humanity as humans on earth. The heroines of our story are two remarkable women, Shifra and Puah. We don't really know who they were. The Torah gives us no more information about them that they were except midwives, instructed by Pharaoh to, when he says, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The Hebrew description of the two women as Hamildot ha'ivriot is ambiguous. It could mean the Hebrew midwives, so most translations and commentaries read it that way, but it could equally mean the midwives to the Hebrews, in which case they may have been Egyptian. What we do know, however, is that they refused to carry out the order. Torah says the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. And this becomes the very first recorded instance in the history of the world of civil disobedience, refusing to obey an unjust order given by the most powerful man in the most powerful empire of the ancient world. They refused because it was immoral, unethical, and inhuman. The Torah suggests that they did it without a whole lot of fuss or drama. Summoned by Pharaoh to explain their behavior, they simply replied, well, Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They're vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives arrive. And to this, Pharaoh had no reply. The matter-of-factness of the entire incident reminds us of one of the most salient findings about the courage of those who saved Jewish lives during the Shoah, the Holocaust. These individuals who were so remarkable, who saved Jews, they had little in common when you looked at all of them, except for the fact that they would say they saw nothing remarkable about what they did. Often the mark of real moral heroes is that they don't see themselves as moral heroes. They do what they do because it's what human beings are supposed to do. And that's probably the meaning of the statement, fearing God. The midwives feared God, and that is probably the Torah's generic description of those who have a moral sense. It took more than 3,000 years for what the midwives did to become enshrined in international law. In 1946, the Nazi war criminals on trial at Nuremberg all offered the defense. You know what they said. They were merely obeying orders given by a duly constituted and democratically elected government. Under the doctrine of national sovereignty, every government has the right to issue its own laws and order its own affairs. But it took a new legal concept, namely a crime against humanity, to establish the guilt of the architects and the administrators of genocide. The Nuremberg Principle gave legal substance to what the midwives instinctively understood, that there are orders and behaviors that should not be obeyed because they are immoral and thereby, by definition, wrong. Moral law transcends and overrides even the law of the Pharaoh, even the mighty dictator, the one who was said to be a representative of God on earth. But as the Talmud teaches us, if there's a conflict between the words of God and the words of a human being, the words of God must prevail. And in our own country, we must remember Thomas Paine, the American patriot, who made a decisive impact in the American Revolution. His pamphlet, Common Sense, was published in January 1776 and became an immediate bestseller. 100,000 copies were sold, and in those times, that was an awful lot. The impact was huge. He became known as the father of the American Revolution. And the opening pages of Common Sense justifies rebellion against a tyrannical king based on citations from the Hebrew Bible. In the same spirit, that same summer, Benjamin Franklin drew as his design for the Great Seal of America a picture of the Egyptians, i.e. the English, drowning in the Red Sea, i.e. the Atlantic, with the caption, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." And Thomas Jefferson was so struck by the sentence that he recommended it to be used on the Great Seal of Virginia and later incorporated it into his own personal seal. The story of the midwives belongs to a larger vision implicit throughout the Torah and the Tanakh as a whole, that right is sovereign over might, and that even God himself can be called to account in the name of justice, as he expressly mandates Avraham to do. Sovereignty ultimately belongs to God. So any human act or order that transgresses the will of God is by that fact alone wrong. These revolutionary ideas are intrinsic to the biblical vision of politics and the use of power. And it was the courage of two remarkable women that created the precedent later taken up by the American writer Thoreau in his classic essay, Civil Disobedience. And then that in turn inspired Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in the 20th century. This didn't come out of Greek literature. No, because in Greek literature, the idea of civil disobedience is really only found in the story of Antigone, who insisted on giving her brother a burial despite the fact that the king had refused to permit it, regarding him as a traitor. So in Sophocles' Antigone, the end is a tragedy because the heroine must die because of her loyalty to her brother and her disobedience to the king. But the Hebrew Bible is not a tragedy. In fact, biblical Hebrew has no word that means tragedy in the Greek sense. There is a belief that good is rewarded, not punished, because the universe, God's work of art, is a world in which moral behavior is blessed, and evil, though briefly in the ascendance, is ultimately defeated. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. meant when he said that the arc of the universe bends towards morality. Shifra and Pua are two of the greatest heroines of world literature, the very first to teach humanity the moral limits of power. Let us all, each and every one of us tonight, be inspired by their courage, their moral stand against evil and oppression and pharaohs. Let us know deep down in each of our hearts that we are far more powerful than we think. And we, like Shifra and Pua, must stand up in outrage to what is happening to our country and make sure that we remain the moral, righteous majority, and that those who seek to defile our country are cast back into the swamp where they came from and understand that they are in the wrong and they are not going to take control in this country. Shabbat Shalom. It is at this moment that we remember all those who we have loved and lost. And during Shloshim, in the last 30 days, we particularly remember Gerald Klein, the cousin of Rabbi Robert Frazen, and Sandra Tavlin, the mother of Kim Sinteo and Steve Tavlin, the grandmother of Michael and Scott Tavlin, the sister of Marvin and Marcia Fish, Buddy and Andrea Fish. And we also recall the yahrzeits of Joseph Antonio, Robert Backer, Rita Banks, Edna Batten, Abe Berkowitz, Francis Bernstein, S. Charles Blutstein, William Buckalter, Betty Bush, Marshall Cooper, Naomi Dawson, David Ehrlich, Morris Ettinger, Henry Fair, Sophia Fair, Milton Fadelman, Helen Forrest, Emil Gartner, Daniel Goldenberg, Marion Goldenberg, Sam Goldwasser, Seymour Gotthelf, Dr. Milton Gottlieb, Irene Hess, Marvin Hochberg, Lisa Kahn, Melvin Kappelman, Henrietta Katzen, Mary Klein, Harry Kushner, Molly Levin, Nathan Levin, Emmanuel Levy, David Lewis, Gladys Lindenbaum, Ethel Luber, Sam Mandel, Gus Margolin, Farida Merrill, Simon Morrison, Sylvia Moskowitz, Miza Newhouse, Milton Parker, Beatrice Raisin, Joyman Roman, Sidney Roberts, David Schlang, Jerry Schuster, Samuel Sefrin, Pauline Siegel, Cecilia Scher, Irving Shapiro, Gerardo Schneiderman, Consuelo Schraga, Samuel Spitz, Saul Taub, David Weiner, Ira Weiner, Morris Weiner, Max Weiss, Ruth Wertheim. In reciting the Kaddish, we affirm our awareness of holiness in our world. Much of our experience of divine goodness, grace, and love has come to us through those whose lives have touched our own. We invoke the transcendent power of love and caring as together we sanctify God's name with Kaddish Yatom. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, Be'olma divrach irutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayechon u'vyomechon u'v'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv imru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah mevorach leolam u'olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal Shemei dekudesha barichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechemata da amiran be'olma v'imru. Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. May the one who brings peace in the heavens bring that same peace, that shalom, down to us here in this world, that we can create shalom amongst us in our nation, that we can find peace. Matthew, I believe we have some announcements.
We do. Doesn't seem that there should be any announcements other than we love everybody, but I will do the best I can and see what I got here. So, good evening. On this 24th day of Tevet, on behalf of the Temple Board of Directors, I would like to thank our Solel family and friends, as well as our global audience, for connecting us virtually and spiritually on the Shabbat evening. Although we may not be able to join all of you in person, please know that Temple Solel is always here for you. In addition to streaming worship services and classes, our lines remain open, and you're encouraged to contact us for your religious, spiritual, and other needs. And a special note from Rabbi Rosen to let all of our congregation know that, especially in these times of uncertainty and stress and fear, please know that you can reach out and speak to him, and he's there for you as well. Each individual act of tzedakah expresses a sacred and enduring Jewish value by connecting us with ourselves, one another, and the world beyond our synagogue door. Your contribution to Temple Solel today demonstrates your dedication to our Jewish heritage, and is a thoughtful expression of thanks to the synagogue, its members and staff. Through your kindness and support, everything we have accomplished will remain, and our hopes and plans for the future will be realized. Thank you in advance for any generosity. There are always 3 ways to donate to Temple Solel. You can go to our website to templesolel.com/donate. You can call the Temple office at 954-989-0205 or email the Temple at admin@templesolel.com to get more information. So I had the opportunity to spend a few minutes with our monthly Vegan Shabbat Zoom dinner. It was, again, well attended. Scott Lewis and the entire Tacoma community, Stephanie Joffe, did such a wonderful job in educating all of the members that showed about some incredible plant-based vegan information. Had a wonderful speaker. We can't thank them enough for what they do and for what they do every day throughout the year. So for all our live virtual events, you can join us in one of 2 ways. First on Temple's Facebook live stream, or join us on the website at templesolel.com/live-feed. So our schedule coming up tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. We have our wonderful Torah study that inspires our minds and challenges us. Rabbi Efrat will be there on the Temple Zoom. We're excited that we get to see our kids come back again. On Sunday, January 10th at 10 a.m., our religious school resumes. And Tuesday, January 12th at 7:30 p.m., again, confirmation class with Rabbi Rosen. We had a very well-attended class last week, and we're looking forward to another great discussion and Torah study with Rabbi Rosen. So a new announcement. So starting this Wednesday morning, and every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., will be coffee and conversation with Rabbi Rosen. Some topics will include personal, domestic, world affairs, or anything that we want to talk about. Please email the temple for the Zoom link to join that session with Rabbi Rosen, and he's very much looking forward to connecting with all of our congregation and anyone that wishes to join. And now some excitement of this week is I can proudly announce that Cantor Rosen is back with Music Time. So this Wednesday at 6 o'clock, he has a special guest, and I apologize if I mess this up, Moti Fuchs, Cantor Emeritus at Hillcrest Jewish Center from Queens, New York, will be joining us as a special guest, and then back again here Friday, January 15th for Shabbat Services. So I thought this would be an appropriate quote for this evening, Rabbi, Cantor, and Robin. Love makes our friends a little dearer. Joy makes our hearts a little lighter. Faith makes our paths a little clearer. Hope makes our lives a little brighter. And peace brings us all a little nearer. So we ask that you all stay safe. We pray that everyone stays in good health. And back to you, Rabbi, Cantor, and Robin, and thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And Cantor, would you lead us in a final song?
God bless America.
Yes, we need that.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. May God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home,